Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Today I am speaking with an award-winning former journalist, foreign correspondent and documentary maker who spent some 20 years reporting for many of the world's most intriguing and possibly troublesome places. In 2002, she moved to Baghdad when her husband was sent there for work. She spent over a year living under Saddam Hussein's dictatorship, time during which she was befriended by a local woman whom she later found out was working as a secret police informant and was reporting her every move. This extraordinary time living under Saddam Hussein and later her experiences during the Iraq War inspired her to write her memoir in 2007 and what was to become her debut novel. This was such an evocative read on so many levels. I could smell the cumin and turmeric, the rose water and the lime tea. I could see the spice markets. It so beautifully captured the uneasy alliance between the old world and the new, between Eastern and Western cultures, an absolutely unforgettable story. The novel is called When Apricots Bloom, published by Hachette, and the author is Gina Wilkinson. And I'm honoured to be speaking with Gina on the podcast today. Welcome, Gina.
Hi, Claudine. Thanks for having me.
Congratulations on the publication of this deeply moving and beautifully written novel. It's a novel that can't fail to make readers aware of the hardships faced by the Iraqi people during Saddam's dictatorship. But more than that, I think it shines a light on the precarious situation of women there, both local and foreign. So I wanted to ask you, how are you feeling about its reception and what feedback have you received following publication?
The reception has actually been fantastic. I've been getting a lot of great feedback, quite a lot of coverage in the media and people talking about it. It was chosen by Australian Women's Weekly as its book club pick, which was quite a sort of nostalgic and wonderful feeling. Actually, it was a bit of mixed emotions because Women's Weekly, I believe, is especially significant for women of my mum's generation. And my mum passed away about 8 years ago. And when I got the news that it was going to be an Australian Women's Weekly pick, I just thought immediately of her and how proud she would have been standing in the checkout at the local supermarket, knowing that Naomi Watts was on the cover and her daughter was in the back section.
Gina, I think it's fair to say that this is a deeply personal novel in that some of what is depicted in it actually happened to you. So can I start by asking you, what was the spark of inspiration for writing this novel?
Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, in 2001, I was living in Bangkok in Thailand, where I was working as a journalist. And my husband, who's Canadian originally, had followed me around the world, first from Canada to Australia and then from Australia to Bangkok. He'd been working very hard as a volunteer and studying, and he got offered a job to go and work for UNICEF in Baghdad. We thought this would be a great opportunity. The only drawback was that at that time, Saddam Hussein did not allow foreign journalists to live in Iraq. So I decided I would put my career temporarily on hold. I'd already been working as a journalist for about 10 years, and he'd go and take that job and I'd go with him. And I've got to admit, even though I wasn't going to be able to work as a journalist, I was intrigued by the idea of going to Baghdad. It had been virtually cut off from the outside world for about 10 years by very stringent Western sanctions. You couldn't fly into the country. There was only a handful of foreigners living there. And, it has been a pivotal country in history, ancient history and modern history as well. So the chance to go there, intrigued me. So I went to Iraq, into Baghdad, and I was very soon befriended by a local woman who I later discovered was working as an informant for Saddam Hussein's secret police and reporting back on where I went, what I did, who I spoke to, and what my husband did and who he spoke to. Mm-hmm. And I should say, straight up that I definitely don't blame her for that. Under Saddam Hussein, if the secret police really wanted you to do something, saying no was not an option, especially for someone like my friend. She had come from relatively humble background and had worked her way up. And I also found out many years later that two of her brothers had been executed by the regime. So I really don't think she was in any position to say no. Over the years, I've always wondered, was it just a job for her, or was it just a duty that she had to perform, or were we really friends? underneath that, because unlike the character in the book that I wrote, I wasn't the first person that she had a relationship with as an informant and someone she was, an informant informee. So I started writing When the Apricots Bloom, imagining what it must have been like for someone like her, beginning with the moment that the secret police come knocking at the door of an Iraqi secretary working at a foreign embassy and tell her that she has to spy on her boss's wife. And so part of the book is written from the perspective of the woman who is doing spying. Part of the book is written from the perspective of the woman who is being spied on, the wife of a foreign diplomat. And there's also a third person, a third narrator, who is an artist in Iraq. And that was one of my other big inspirations, Iraq's amazing art scene. When I got to Baghdad, I was very excited to discover that there were more than 24 independent art galleries operating there at the time. There was a really vibrant art scene. And, it was one of the few places where I could go and associate semi-freely with Iraqis, because artists in Iraq have always held this sort of place where they are conduits to the outside world. Iraq has been a centre of art throughout history, and artists have always been this conduit between the outside world and the deeper society of Iraq. And so that was really my inspiration. It was that personal relationship with a woman who was also informing on me, and also some of the things that inspired me about Iraq that I found wonderful and that I knew readers probably wouldn't have seen on their TV screens or seen in the newspaper during the war on Iraq. And that, that's left an image in many people's minds that is probably what they go to when they hear Iraq. They probably think of that. But of course, any country is much more complex and has both light and shade, good and negative in its entirety, or, if you look at it holistically. So I wanted to shine a light both on all that spectrum of experiences that I had in Iraq.
For those who haven't read it yet, could you tell me a little bit more about the story and about these women?
So Huda comes from a fairly humble background. She was a village girl. And when she was young, she had a close relationship with the Sheikh's granddaughter. That granddaughter is Rania, who goes on to become an artist. There's an event that happens that forces the two of them apart, and they're estranged when we start the novel. They haven't spoken to each other in many, many years. And the third woman, Ali, who is a diplomat's wife, she is the one that brings them back into contact again. So they have questions of their past. They both feel betrayed by the other, and they're forced to try and learn to trust each other over the course of the book. Huda is, as we mentioned, the person who is forced to spy on Ali. So I really wanted to get into the mindset and explore the issue and the circumstances of people in extreme circumstances. What do they do? What do they do when they're put in a situation that runs contrary to their own ethics and their own morals? Do they rise above it, or do they not live up to their best expectations or what they want for themselves and what they see as right, and what's the impact of that on their own psyche over time? Huda also has a teenage son that she has to protect. The secret police, or the Mukhabarat, one of the things they use to leverage her or for power over her is to threaten to conscript her teenage son into a militia that was run by Saddam Hussein's son, Uday. So she's trying to keep him out of the militia, and that's the leverage that the Mukhabarat hold over her that's most powerful and has the biggest impact on her. Ali is an Australian diplomat's wife, newly married, a former journalist, so I sort of used my own inspiration there, write what you know. And she goes to Iraq under a terrible visa category, which I myself also had, which is the category of dependent spouse. So Ali goes there as a dependent spouse, and she's searching for information about her mother, who died when she was very young, and her mother was a nurse working in Baghdad in the 1970s. This is actually quite a common thing in Baghdad in the 1970s. It was a very cosmopolitan city. There were lots of women working there as nurses, as teachers. There were a lot of foreign businessmen. There was quite a large community, and it was actually quite a tourist hotspot, which is something that I try to shine a light on as well. So there are quite a few references to this period in Iraq, which many Iraqis refer to as the golden years, when people water skied on the Tigris. There were bars and cafes, casinos, obviously none of which was happening when I was there in the early 2000s. So I'm trying to contrast those two periods in time. Ali is hiding a few secrets. Her mother was actually American, and Americans were banned from Iraq when I was there. And if that comes out during the novel, she'd definitely get into some serious strife. And the third person is Rania, as I mentioned, was the daughter of a sheikh, but over time her family has lost its power and its fortune, and she's really down on her luck financially when we meet her. In fact, the first scene is set at a wonderful book market in Baghdad called Mushanabi Market, and she is there to sell off the last of her grandfather's library. That was one thing that I found very, emotional. I loved going to Mushanabi book market, but it was hard to see these wonderful, precious books piled up, knowing that they had come from somebody's library and they'd probably had to sell it off for just a few cents. I tried to show sort of the fall of the former, more aristocratic class who were displaced and pushed out of power by Saddam Hussein, and how they tried to navigate their changing circumstances. They still had some sort of respect, that protected them in some ways. And we see that in Rania's dealings with foreigners. She has more contact with foreigners at the art gallery that she runs, and she is protected by her history and her family's history to some extent, but not completely. And later on in the novel, her teenage daughter comes under threat as a result of her uneasy relationship with the regime. So I tried to look at the different pressures upon the three women. Huda, who is trying to keep her job, trying to keep her family together and her son safe. Rania, who is trying to keep a roof over her head and keep her daughter safe. And Ali, who is trying to find a connection to her dead mother and to discover what happened to her mother in Iraq and why, when she left Iraq, she was so different from when she arrived.
A thoroughly fascinating read on so many levels, Gina. But what I wanted to know in particular was, when did you learn about what your friend had been doing, and how did that impact you at the time? And did she ever know that you had uncovered her secret?
Yeah, that is a very complicated relationship. And in fact, sometimes I wonder, if authors turn to fiction because then they can answer the questions that they don't get answers to in their real lives. I suspected something was amiss. She was willing to be seen in public with me, whereas my other Iraqi friends didn't like to be seen in public with me. We would meet in private venues. So that made me think it was suspicious. She was also very controlling about what I did, where I went. I tried to put it down to jealousy, but, I felt something was off. And when I shared this with my few foreign friends that lived there, of course, would never mention this to any of my Iraqi friends. They would tell me that I was being paranoid. But after the war, when Saddam Hussein was ousted, many Iraqis came forward at many different workplaces and outed informant. Many Iraqis had to answer questions to the secret police and provide information. But then there was a step up where you were perhaps getting some sort of reward, or you were a more active informant. So she fell into this category. Her colleagues came forward and identified her, and she lost her job as a result. She came to me when she lost her job and asked me if I could help her. And in fact, I was good friends with her boss. So I went to see him and I said, "Why are you getting rid of her? This seems crazy. You've got all these foreigners now, Americans coming in. She speaks great English." And he told me what had happened. It wasn't actually a surprise to me. It more or less confirmed what I had thought. We never really discussed it. I made a date with her to have lunch together, actually at a place that features often in the story. It's a riverside restaurant where you eat on floating pontoons. I used to go there quite often with her, and I arranged to meet her around the time that I was preparing to leave Baghdad. I felt like I had to clear the air with her because I knew she was disappointed with me, that she felt I hadn't done enough to help her get a new job. And we went there for lunch. I decided I was just going to tell her what I knew, that I didn't blame her, but that was the reason why I hadn't been able to help her more actively find a job. But as I was about to start that very difficult conversation, she said something that I interpreted as a threat. She told me that if I didn't get a job, it wouldn't be safe for my husband to come back to Iraq. He'd actually been evacuated from Iraq after the UN was blown up in a suicide bombing, and some of our closest friends, 22 of our colleagues, were killed that day. And so she might have been making a bad joke. It's possible. But it made me very nervous, and so I didn't say anything. I basically chickened out, and I just kept quiet and I didn't talk about it. I had another opportunity several years later to talk to her about it, and my other Iraqi friends actually asked me not to. They said that since Saddam had gone, under Saddam, they had known, the Iraqis knew who was an informant, even though they didn't share it with foreigners, obviously. They knew who was who. But under the new situation, the power structure had splintered, and now they didn't know who was working for who, if anybody was working for anybody. They didn't know if she was working for anyone or connected to anybody, but they were worried that if she knew I knew, she would know they probably knew as well because they were my friends. And while I really wanted to have some sort of closure with my friend, I wanted to resolve this point of tension between us. I really felt at the time that my personal desires were not as important as my Iraqi friends' need to feel secure. It was around 2008 that we met again, and it was a really terrible time in Iraq's history. Many of my friends had been forced to leave the country. People were being kidnapped and murdered. So I didn't feel that I could really put my own desire to resolve that relationship over their feelings of safety and security. I don't hold anything against her, but obviously it did have an impact on our relationship. And it was, even while I was there, it was having an impact on our relationship because I felt, that I was being controlled, that I had my suspicions. I guess that's one of the reasons why fiction is such a great source of understanding, that you can explore why someone else would do something. You can look into questions that you can't get in your own life. Fiction can look at the different sides to a situation or a dilemma. And I guess that's, why I was still thinking of it so many years later and started writing When the Apricots Bloom.
I've spoken to many people on this podcast who deal with grief or trauma through their writing. And so what I'm hearing from you is that writing this novel really helped you work through your own feelings and experiences from being there at that time.
I would say that is definitely true. It was obviously something that I was still thinking about. And, when I left Iraq, it was the end of 2003. A couple of years later, I was diagnosed with PTSD and depression, which I suffered for quite a few years related to things that happened in Iraq. And I remember going to see a counsellor. I was living in Sri Lanka at the time. There was one psychologist for the whole country, and I went and got an appointment with her finally, and I went in and talked to her, and she said, if you're plagued by these recurring feelings, these recurring bad thoughts and moments in your life, write them down on a piece of paper, screw it up into a ball, and then throw it away. And, I don't know if that's a long-term strategy for dealing with trauma, but it was actually surprisingly effective in the short term. That's also when I started writing my memoir, which was about the real events that happened to me. While When the Apricots Bloom was inspired by this relationship with my friend, the plot itself is fiction. So there's lots of bits and pieces in there that I took out of my own life, but the plot itself is an invented story. I think both of them served a purpose in helping me to connect the dots, especially my first memoir that helped me to understand how things happened. You know, when they talk about the fog of war, that is so true. And I definitely left Iraq feeling confused and very disillusioned. You know, one of the things that I did when I was writing the character of Ali, I did make her quite naive. I feel like I was naive when I went into Iraq, even though I'd been a journalist for quite a long time, and I knew that bad things did happen to good people, and good people make bad mistakes. There's something about being a young person. You know, I was just 30 when I went into Iraq, which I'm 50 now, so looking back, I call it young. But I think I still had that sort of Teflon feeling of a young person, that it's not going to happen to you. And even though you know it can happen to anyone, you just don't believe that it's going to happen to you. Obviously, that's not true. The first time that hit home was, I guess, when the UN was destroyed in a suicide bombing. So unlike the character of Ali, who feels very isolated and stuck at home, I actually went out and got a job working at UN headquarters in Baghdad. You know, there were a lot of events there that really opened my eyes, I guess. Definitely writing helped to process what had happened. And for that, I am grateful.
I want to talk about attitudes towards women for a moment. There's no coincidence, I'm sure, that your main characters are all women. And the attitudes towards women in Iraq at the time you've captured so well, not only about women's role in Iraqi society, but attitudes towards foreign women in general. So could you tell me why this was important for you to explore for the purposes of this novel?
Well, I guess there's my own experience, but also when you look at fiction, particularly fiction that is related to wartime or dictatorship, extreme events, they tend to be told by men. And I remember at the time that I started writing this, the first sort of wave of fiction written by Westerners about Iraq was all from male soldiers' point of view. I wanted to look at it from a different perspective, and being a woman, you know, that's my own experience. While I did work for the UN, I was also a homemaker in Baghdad. You know, I met up with a friend just after I left Iraq, and he was also a journalist. He had worked in Lebanon. And I said I'd been, you know, studying Arabic, and he asked me how my Arabic was going. He had also been studying Arabic. It turned out that we had two completely different vocabularies. I could talk about my family, things I like to do, fruits and vegetables and cooking and flowers, and he knew things like long live the revolution. So we had a very different, you know, even the things that we would talk about in our daily lives were so far apart, being men and women. I also wanted to show, you know, I think some people in the West have this preconception that all Middle Eastern women are repressed, forced to wear the headscarf, and so on. And I found a very different experience in Baghdad at that time. Only one of my Iraqi friends wore the headscarf. That was something that she chose to do. That I think has changed over the years since Saddam's ousting. But at that time, it was a very secular society. Women actually had quite a prominent role in society. They drove themselves around, unlike some other places in the Middle East at that time, say Saudi Arabia, women weren't allowed to drive. My friends were engineers, doctors, lawyers. Iraq had one of the highest rates of higher education for women in the region. Women occupied important positions in society and in government. So, you know, while Saddam Hussein was a terrible, terrible dictator, he also, on the other hand, strangely, was also a proponent of women's rights for much of his rule. So I wanted to show, you know, that Iraqi women did have quite a lot of power, that they were in the workforce making their own decisions, and also at home not 100% obedient to their husband's wishes or anything like that. They weren't shrinking violets. As you mentioned, women who are Iraqi and women who were Western women were treated differently. Personally, myself, and you can see through the character of Ali, there was a lot of harassment on the streets of foreign women, although there were hardly any. When I went outside, I did not see another foreign woman on the streets ever. And I think that was also because Iraq had been cut off from the world outside for 10 years. And so many young Iraqis, their views of what a foreign woman is and how a foreign woman behaves was shaped by Western media, cheesy movies with girls in bikinis, whereas older Iraqis who had grown up with many foreigners working and visiting had a different view. And in fact, there's a conversation very early on in the book where Rania and an older male friend of hers see Ali being harassed on the street and talk about, gosh, what is wrong with the young men of today. And I also wanted to show the many similarities that Iraqi women would share with women in many parts of the world. They fall off the diet bandwagon, have trouble with rebellious teenagers. They have to juggle work and home life. And so these are things that I think, many women in Australia will see, parts of their own lives reflected in the pages of the novel. And I did want to show that it wasn't such a strange alien environment. Personally, I felt quite at home in Iraq, which people, if they base their ideas on, what they've seen in the mainstream media, would probably be quite shocked to hear. But at that time, my Iraqi friends were not living a much different life than I was living, although, it should be said, the big difference, of course, was that we were living under a dictator and we couldn't really say what we felt about many important things out loud. One thing that I really do hope that people take away when they read the book is that despite our different backgrounds, we really do share so much in common. And especially at this moment in time, society feels so divided. We're really retreating into our own tribes in a way, where we only hear from people who think like ourselves, especially if we're talking about social media, which is where so many people get their information from nowadays. And that's why I think, books are so important because especially fiction, it allows you to step into somebody else's shoes, someone that you would never meet in your ordinary life, and you would get a chance to experience what they experience. And when I tell people I was friends with a woman who turned out to be an informant, often their first reaction is, oh my gosh, that is terrible. And they assume that, oh, she must be a horrible person. And, obviously I have the same discussion with them where I say, it wasn't her fault. I don't blame her. And, I hope when people read this book, they think, well, what would I have done in her circumstances? And, personally myself, I think I probably would have done something very similar, although possibly I would not have been, I don't want to give away any spoilers here either, but, perhaps I would not even have had the courage that she displays as the story progresses.
Harking back to what you said earlier about, some Iraqi women, Huda was definitely no shrinking violet.
That's right, yeah. There's actually an Arabic term for housewife or homemaker. The Arabic version is goddess of the house. That gives you an idea that, they're not quite the way that they are stereotyped in our perceptions, I guess. I also wanted to show, the good humor that many of my Iraqi friends had, and also their resilience. My Iraqi friends have been through so much. I mentioned to you about the bombing of the UN. One day I went into UNICEF where my husband was working, and some of my closest Iraqi friends I met there and am still in touch with, and actually helped me with fact-checking this book. I remember they had a painting made of one of our good friends who had been killed in that bombing, and they brought it out to show me. They were asking what I thought of it, and I was sitting there with this portrait of him in my hands, and I started crying. I remember them telling me, you can cry now, that's okay, you should cry now, but you have to keep going. You have to keep doing the best that you can, keep living the best life that you can, because that is what he would have wanted. I just found that their resilience and their strength so inspiring. And that was something else that I wanted to put into this book. They had been through so much, but they didn't turn bitter. They weren't cynical. That's something that I think is to be admired.
Now, the legendary Persian queen Scheherazade is referred to a few times throughout this novel, and I don't think this is a coincidence. I believe that there are parallels between her story and what happens to Huda, Rania, and Ali in this novel. But for those who don't know about Scheherazade, I was wondering, Gina, could you tell us a little bit more about her and why she appears here in your story?
Scheherazade is the narrator of the 1001 Arabian Nights, the great tales that many people are familiar with. Sinbad the Sailor, Ali Baba is another one. While people do know these individual stories, I think a lot of people don't know the wider story. Those stories were a collection of stories that were narrated by a fictional character called Scheherazade. And in the story, Scheherazade is sold off to a sultan who lives in Baghdad. And the sultan has some sort of inferiority complex. He marries women, and then the next morning, afraid that they could betray him, he has them executed. So when she becomes his wife, she's his 1000th wife, and she's trying to stay alive. So each night she tells a story, the story of Ali Baba, or the story of Sinbad the Sailor. But she finishes telling her story just before the climax. So the Sultan keeps her alive because he wants to hear the end of the story. So the next day she tells the end of the story and starts a new story. And in that way, she is able to keep herself alive and finally win his trust. Actually, there's a statue in Baghdad in Shehrazade's honor on the banks of the Tigris that I used to walk past quite often. I really love that statue, and I write about it in the book, especially because Baghdad was full of statues of Saddam Hussein. Everywhere you looked, Saddam Hussein murals, Saddam Hussein statues, Saddam Hussein billboards. And there were only a few who had survived being replaced by Saddam Hussein, and she was one of them. She's another of these tenacious women that manages to get by with her smarts. And so I do bring her up quite often in the book because also she is telling tales to stay alive, just like Huda is telling stories about Ali to stay alive. Rania, she is an artist. She has to walk this line where she gets requests from Saddam Hussein to paint his portrait. So she's creating art and her version of telling a story to stay alive. Ali is also telling lies as well. So I wanted to bring up this perhaps lesser known character in literature who was the brains in a way behind those stories in the fictional world and shine a light on her. And so she pops up quite often as a symbol of resilience and also as a symbol of someone who is telling stories to stay alive.
A smart, clever, resourceful woman, our Scheherazade, that's for sure. And she's definitely one of my favourite characters.
It was so refreshing to have a statue that wasn't about Saddam Hussein. And, it was one of the things that I try and show in this book is that strange experience of living under a dictator where his face was everywhere. Everywhere you went, you would see him. And yet his name was completely taboo. It was considered very rude to say his name out loud, mainly because people were worried about hidden microphones or attracting the attention of an informant. It was, definitely dangerous to say, even joke about Saddam Hussein could, end up with terrible consequences. So people didn't say his name out loud. Sometimes they had code words that they used instead. One of my friends at home, they would refer to Saddam Hussein if they were talking about him as the brown cow. When I moved to Iraq, I was warned that I should assume that my house was bugged, that the office was bugged, and if my husband and I wanted to have a conversation that we didn't want the authorities to know about, we should go for a walk or we should go out to the garden because microphones need a power supply. So if you went outside, you're less likely to be heard. So we censored our own conversations in our own house that we were renting. And if there was anything urgent that we had to say to each other at that moment, we would go to the bathroom and we would turn on the shower and we would turn on all the taps and then we would whisper in each other's ears. I try and portray some of that paranoia throughout the book. There's a scene in there that I definitely took from my own life at one stage when we were sure we were being bugged, and I actually looked in all the lights and looked into the air conditioning vent. I had a paranoid day, and my husband came home from work and was like, what have you been doing? And I'm like, oh, I've just been searching for bugs. And although I didn't say it outside, we had to go for a walk for me to mention that.
Now, Gina, there is ongoing discussion or debate, if you like, in the publishing world about cultural appropriation and whether authors should be writing voices that don't reflect their own experiences or cultural heritage. And as a Western woman writing from the point of view of two Iraqi women in this book, did you have any reservations about writing Huda and Rania?
When I started writing it, I guess I wasn't thinking so much about that, but I was thinking, will my Iraqi friends be happy that I'm writing this? And I did reach out to some of them, and they were actually thrilled. They said, we would love you to write that story and get out our perspective, because that it is more than what most people know about Iraq. I do agree that the publishing industry has marginalized authors who are outside the white Western mainstream for far too long. We do need more diverse books written by diverse authors in the whole spectrum of situations and settings that exist in the world. And I feel, that readers are ready to embrace those stories, but to make that happen, publishers and bookstores need to put the books on the shelves and in the front windows. And I think that's happening. And I think that they are seeing, on the business side, that there is demand to hear from people from all perspectives, and definitely from more diverse authors than has been the case in the past. At the same time, I don't believe in setting rigid rules about who has the right to tell which stories, or that an author should be confined to writing only about characters that have a similar background or a same genetic code. In fact, the very talented novelist Zadie Smith, she penned an essay where she talked about how she had written from the perspective of adult and child, male and female, black, brown, white, gay, straight, liberal, conservative, and even alive and dead. And I've got to say, I agree with her that authors and their characters don't need to have what she called matching autobiographical coordinates. But at the same time, I do see what people are saying about cultural appropriation. And I took a lot of care to consult with my Iraqi friends to get their help with fact-checking to make sure I got the details right. At the time that the push for greater diversity and the Our Own Voices movement was gaining traction, I was part of a writers group in Washington, D.C., where I was living at the time. And that writers group was made up mostly of women from the Middle East or first-generation Arab American women. I actually brought it up with them and I said, what do you think about me writing this book? Actually, they read the first chapters before they met me in person, and they told me that they assumed that perhaps I was an Arab person who had married a Westerner. So they didn't notice anything that they wouldn't have written. They said they didn't see errors in there. A Jordanian friend of mine, she was writing from the perspective of an American teenage boy. Another woman from Iran was writing a novel just being published next month from the perspective of a Polish princess who was kidnapped by Genghis Khan, a sort of historical fiction based on fact. I agree that we do need more diversity, but also, like I said, setting these sort of rigid rules about who has the right to tell which stories can also have its drawbacks and limit creative freedom. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that I tried to show in this is the similarities and the things that we all share, and that if it's done right, books can unite us and they illuminate the things we have in common rather than keep us divided. I felt like I did have a story to tell and that I could tell this story in an effective way. As a journalist, I've been telling stories of people from all sorts of backgrounds that, I had, in fact, much less understanding of.
Gina, there are many writers who listen to this podcast, and I wondered, given your experiences in the publishing sphere and with your journalistic pursuits, and now this wonderful novel, Do you have any tips to offer writers listening and who are seeking publication of their novel or about writing generally?
Yeah, well, firstly, I would say don't give up. I queried so many agents. I think it was like 100 agents. It took like over a year to find an agent for this novel, and now I have a fantastic agent, and she's managed to sell this book all over the world. So don't give up would be one of my suggestions. Definitely, if you can join writers groups, I think that's a great help. And when you do get feedback, I would say always give yourself time to absorb it. Sometimes I'd get feedback in writers groups and I think, oh, that doesn't apply at all. They didn't understand it at all, blah, blah, blah. And then I would go home and the next day I'd think, you know what, that's actually true. So I would say, learn to take constructive criticism and definitely give yourself time to think about what people are saying, not just like 5 minutes, but a couple days to sink in. I often found like the day after the writers group or 2 days after I got feedback, it would all click. And I'd be like, oh, yes, okay, I see what they're saying. So definitely try and get feedback. But then also, in some ways you need to stick to your true purpose. Take criticism with a grain of salt, but always give it a lot of thought. That would be my advice. Don't instantly dismiss any suggestions for improving your work. In terms of writing, read a lot. Find the authors that you love, read them if you have time, and be inspired by them. It's hard to be a writer if you're not also a reader. It is a tough business, I gotta say. Being a writer, you put a lot of effort in. There's no guarantee that anyone apart from maybe your closest friends and family are ever going to read your work. Most novelists and writers, we are driven by something larger than we can control. I guess, storytellers throughout the ages have had a desire this impulse to tell stories, and there's certainly more profitable things, easier things that you could be doing, but often it's just something that you have to do to feel that you've got something to share with a wider audience. You've got a truth that you want to illuminate through fiction or through your non-fiction writing. So keep going. That would be my advice.
Gina, are you working on anything else at the moment?
Yeah, I am thinking about a story actually set in Western Australia. I grew up in WA in a variety of very small towns. When I first started out as a journalist in the late 80s, it was a time when inflation and interest rates in Australia were extremely high. I think almost like in the high 18%, something like that. A lot of farmers were going bust. And a movement arose. I believe there might have been something similar in the eastern states, but I'm not sure. But in WA, it was called the Rebel Rural Farmers Association. They were actually threatening to kidnap bank managers. I remember that because my father was a bank manager at that time. So I remember it very vividly. And at the same time, I often interviewed the spokesman of the Rebel Rural Farmers Association, and I talked about how I was from the country, and we have our own vocabulary. I would ask him about his crops and so on, and I spent a lot of my time on farms. My closest friends were all farming kids, so I worked on farms, and so I had quite a good rapport with the Rural Rebel Farmers Association, and at the same time I thought one day he might ask me, so why were you in the country? Were you a farming kid? And I'd have to confess the truth. But I was thinking about setting something during that period in time, looking at that very stressful time. And I've got to say, also attracted to the 80s because it is pre-cell phone age. In terms of suspense, it's pretty hard to keep things tense when someone could Google their way out of something or call for help, send a text message. So the 80s I'm definitely attracted to, and I've got to say that was something that helped to build suspense in When the Apricots Bloom, because there was no cell phone access in Iraq at that time, and even the phones only worked so. You asked earlier if I had any tips for writers. I would also actually, one of the things I should say is set yourself a daily schedule and write every day, or at least 5 days a week. And personally, that is where I have been falling down the last year, is trying to stick to that daily schedule. And I find that is so important. If you want to be a writer, you have to be disciplined and sit down and start writing. I think probably many people are in the same boat at the moment with remote schooling, trying to juggle, your day job and finding the time to carve out a few hours where you can sit down and work on your manuscript is a real challenge.
Gina, I wanted to say that I thoroughly enjoyed when the Apricots Bloom, an insightful, evocative and ultimately hopeful read that I am sure people the world over will relate to. Thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, it was my pleasure, Claudine. Thanks so much. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.